I'm Rosie Perez, and this is WBAI, listener-supported, non-commercial radio in New York.
Welcome to Sunday, Gothamites. Adam J. Sachs, your host here. Join me as we go beyond the pale every Sunday at noon on WBAI, listener-sponsored free speech radio, streaming live on the internet at WBAI.org, and go to our website, beyondthepale.org, for a full archive with links, and don't forget the Pacifica app for iPhone that gives you access to markets of radio streaming in 5 different cities across the country. Well, today we are 1 week before the 99th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide and the Memorial Day for the Armenian Genocide, which is April 24th, and we are going to devote a large segment of our show today to remembering and discussing the Armenian Genocide. We have a special guest with us who we will introduce shortly, but I would like to provide an introduction for our listeners. When discussing this issue, one has to confront the reality that the full knowledge and contours have not received the hearing and the knowledge of the public as they should.
Let me stress that the Turkish people firmly believe that what happened to the Armenians was not genocide.
For 9 decades, they've denied this ever happening. It's such an anachronism. It's shocking.
We have no reluctance to recognize genocide in Darfur. We have no reluctance to talk about the Cambodian genocide or the Rwandan genocide or the Holocaust. Why is it only this genocide?
It is incredible that Orphan Pamuk now faces 3 years in prison for what? For daring to even say that this should be discussed in Turkey today.
They are in denial. They're covering their tracks. They mocked the dead.
It's the last major taboo in Turkish politics. The authorities are afraid their own people will find out what happened.
Our society, our culture, we do not commit genocide. We will never accept an accusation like that.
But for those of you who aren't aware, there was a genocide that did take place against the Armenian people.
Overseas tonight, a critical American ally is up in arms, quite literally, about something that happened yesterday on Capitol Hill.
I see a hypocrisy in not recognizing the Armenian genocide simply because there is, quote-unquote, an ally who doesn't want us to do so.
Before we move to our guest who we are honored to have, Mark Momjian, a former Assembly board member of the Armenian Assembly, would like to provide a fuller picture for our listeners to get some of the background. Now, first of all, the 1.5 million Armenian victims of World War I constituted the same percentage of casualties of that conflict as did the Jewish victims in the Second World War, between 10 and 15%. Furthermore, 1/3 of the worldwide Armenian population was murdered, the same percentage as the worldwide Jewish population during the Holocaust. And first of all, what was unique, what one can claim about the Armenian genocide as similar to the Holocaust, is that it was the culmination of centuries-long persecution. Unlike if one were to take the case of Bosnia, for instance, or Rwanda, and of course genocide should be applied in all of these cases, nevertheless, in Bosnia and in Rwanda, one had a situation where one could almost characterize the events as revenge killings, as perpetrators of one generation became victims of the next. In the case of the Jews and Armenians, we have the two most historically persecuted peoples, arguably, in the world, and that begins with the formation of the Armenian kingdom in both the classical and medieval period, which was overrun, and persecution, decimation followed. And then even until the 19th century, where under the Sultan of Turkey, Abdulhamid II, hundreds of thousands of Armenians were massacred in events prior to the genocide during the war itself. And if we take this other important distinction between the Holocaust is that the Armenian genocide happened in the historic homeland of the Armenian people, which is to say that the despoliation and the destruction of heritage, which continues and has continued for 9 decades, and just to provide one example, that over the 2,500 churches that existed in historic Armenia, in Turkish Armenia, less than 1% remain today, and nevertheless they are in certainly no condition of use. Other similarities to also mention between the Holocaust and the Armenian genocide is the presence of a German role and involvement. In particular, the railway, the Berlin-Baghdad railway that was used for the deportations was funded by German capital as well. And certainly due to the alliance between the German Empire and the Turkish government at the time, there were German officers in the Turkish army in full awareness and witnessing the massacres as they took place. Now, before we move to Mr. Momjian, I would like to mention and share with you the history of Jewish advocacy and involvement for Armenians, and to mention one particular name who might not that well be well known for our public today, Israel Zangwill, who was a British Jewish author. He was a playwright also. You may know the term The Melting Pot, which was based on a play of his. And he actually dissented from the Zionist fold because of the fact that he believed that conditions in Palestine, were that to be a Jewish homeland, would lead to unceasing civil war. He thus set out in pursuit of what we might think of as more fanciful destinations empty of current inhabitants, including Cyrenia, Uganda, parts of Canada, and Australia. And his shift away from Herzl and the Zionist movement occurred just at the time of the Armenian genocide. And his reflections on the crisis in Armenia brought home to him that in this most modern era, the most primitive instincts inside humans could return with a vengeance. He wrote of the diabolism of human nature that returns to that prehistoric animal nature through which the soul has slowly struggled. I would like to read, before we move to our guest, what I think is a pristine and summation of the parallelism between the centuries of suffering and the ultimate isolation in their hour of greater and greatest need that confronted both Armenians and Jews. On Ararat alone no ark can rest. For Armenia alone there is the cry without answer, Watchman, what of the night? For Armenia alone there is no mandatory. She cannot find protection even in the lion's den or the eagle's nest. There is neither oil nor gold nor aught worth the cost of defending her. The nations, eager to mother more oleaginous or orate territories, so eager that they will be at one another's throats rather than forego their loving labor, here vie with one another only in their solicitousness to offer the task to America. And there was a discussion after the end of the First World War for an American mandate over Armenia, subsequently did not come to pass, which meant the loss of the historic Armenian homelands. Sister nations, I have become accustomed to think, the Armenians and the Jews. Both hail from sister lands of the cradle of civilization. Both come trailing clouds of glory from the purpureal days of Persia and Babylon. Both have borne the shock of the ancient and medieval empires and of the militant migrations of their races. And both hold to their original faith. For if the one was the first preacher of Jehovah, the other was the first nation to profess Jesus. And sisters too in sorrow, I thought, exiled, scattered, persecuted, massacred. Sisters in sooth, ye not equal in suffering, hit hereto through the long centuries the crown of martyrdom has been preeminently Israel's. And as day by day during this war of ours, there came to me by dark letter or whisper the tale of her woes in the central war zone, I said to myself, surely the cup is full. Surely no people on earth has such a measure of gall and vinegar to drain. But I was mistaken. One people is suffering more. That people whose ancient realm held the legendary Eden has now for abiding place the pit of hell. I bow before this higher majesty of sorrow. I take the crown of thorns from Israel's head, and I place it upon Armenia's. Allow me to please introduce our guest today. Good afternoon. Welcome, Mr. Mark Momjian.
Thank you, Adam.
Mr. Momjian is a lawyer in private practice for over 25 years, a native of Philadelphia, an advocate for social justice and civil rights on behalf of numerous communities, including the indigent and homeless. Mr. Momjian is the current chair of the Armenian Center at his alma mater, Columbia University, and he has previously served on the board of directors of the Armenian Assembly of America. If we may begin, Mr. Momjian, thank you for your patience during the introduction. If you would care to add or share or expand on any of the basic facts of introduction that I had wanted to provide for our listeners.
Well, Adam, I just want to thank you. I thought your introduction was poignant, and I am grateful that you shared Zangwill's very compelling sense of the profound loss that the Armenians experienced in the first genocide of the 20th century. There have been many instances where Jewish leaders around the world came to advocate on behalf of the Armenians, both during the genocide and in its aftermath. Many of your listeners are familiar with Henry Morgenthau Sr., for instance, who was U.S. ambassador to Constantinople during the genocide. His memoir, Ambassador Morgenthau's Story, talks about the race extermination of the Armenian people committed by then Ottoman Empire. A young Rabbi Stephen Wise was also a huge advocate for the Armenians during this terrible period in their history. So there are others. Louis Einstein was the attaché to the embassy in Constantinople, wrote a book called Inside Constantinople, where he talked about this plan to exterminate the Armenian race. There were many Jews worldwide who recognized what was happening and who advocated on behalf of this people because of the crime that was committed.
If you would give us a sense, to the extent that you would like, even of your own background, but the way in which that the Armenian genocide impacts upon the Armenian genocide, the community of Armenians in the United States, the Armenian diaspora, and even in the sense of family backgrounds, to what extent, as similar to Holocaust survivors, that the Armenian community was started in the United States by survivors, people who had lost all of their families. If you could give us some insight to the personal background, the family background, even of yourself or of some of your friends and colleagues.
Well, thank you for giving me that opportunity. I'm a second-generation Armenian American. All four of my grandparents were born in the city of Malatya, which is on the Euphrates River. Armenians have been in the United States, surprisingly, since Jamestown. Many people don't know that. They were here during the Civil War. Many fought in the Civil War. But as you pointed out, there was an influx of Armenian immigrants coming to the country during the massacres under Sultan Abdul Hamid II, when between 200,000 and 300,000 Armenians were massacred in the 1890s. As you pointed out, being a second-generation Armenian American, we feel a huge responsibility to the over 1 million Armenians who were killed during the genocide. That trauma is a part of our very being. We live to commemorate that loss during World War I. We commemorate it not only on April 24th, but it's a part of every Armenian's existence. We certainly commemorate it worldwide. And, of course, as you pointed out, this April 24th marks the 99th anniversary of this crime that's often referred to as the forgotten genocide. Sometimes I actually take contest to that characterization, because there has been more affirmation of the Armenian genocide in the last generation than probably at any time prior to the perpetrating of the Armenian genocide. There's been amazing scholarship documenting the incontrovertible facts of the Armenian genocide. So it is a crime that is well known around the world. It's a crime that's been recognized by numerous countries around the world. And as an Armenian American, I'm certainly take my part seriously. I chair the Armenian Center at Columbia University, and we hold many programs in New York to commemorate this unbelievable crime.
And to clarify for our audiences who might not know exactly why April 24th is the Armenian Genocide Memorial Day, and also another shared similarity and parallelism, that to a great extent the Armenian population in the Ottoman Empire was a mediator of modernity, disproportionately educated in the commercial merchant class, and even, for one example, a lot of the major modern buildings in the capital of Turkey, Istanbul, designed and created by Armenian architects. And the 24th commemorates the day in which one could, I think, refer to it as the decapitation of the Armenian leadership, that as a prelude to the mass genocide, the leadership, the elite of the community, intelligentsia, church leaders, were rounded up in the city of Constantinople on the 24th in the several hundreds and summarily executed, which of course had a tremendous impact on the Young Turk government in their ability to then follow through with genocide. But if you would please add to, if they in particular commemorations on that day, I know certainly in the Republic of Armenia, or if you would add to the background about that particular day.
Well, April 24th obviously is the key date because, as you point out, more than 200 Armenian intellectuals were rounded up and summarily murdered by the Turkish government. These people consisted of lawyers, doctors, educators, teachers, clergy. The brain center of the Armenian leadership in Constantinople was rounded up and murdered. The Armenians look at this date as the operative date of the beginning of the genocide, even though it was planned many months prior to that. And of course, as you pointed out earlier in your introductory comments, this is a culmination. Armenians were subject to slaughter and massacre during the 1890s, again during the revolution and counter-revolutionary period in 1909, and then the final stage of genocide, the great crime, the great calamity, as the Armenians describe it, culminated in 1915 and went through to 1923. And that's why we celebrate April 24th worldwide. In Armenia, obviously, everything stops. I mean, businesses close, and every Armenian pays respects at the Armenian memorial, laying a flower at the tomb. And of course, this is, as we come closer to the centennial anniversary, this becomes even more of a worldwide event. But Armenians all throughout the diaspora commemorate April 24th, and understandably so.
And I would like to now move to this larger issue of the fact that it has certainly increased, as you note, in recent decades. And this is an insight provided by Bernard-Henri Lévy, who was a French-Jewish intellectual who has made also the Armenian cause central to his own work, who said, of course, that the perfect crime is the ability to erase the very evidence of the crime itself.
Indeed.
And it seems that in the case of Turkey and the modern Turkish government, that crime has been perpetuated and extended for 90 years in an ongoing attempt to a negationist genocide denial attempt to erase the evidence. And not only that, and this is from experience amongst the American landscape of historians, has attempted to suppress discussion, even in a scholarly academic forum. I mean, I can even mention a World War I conference held at the Soldiers and Sailors Club just this past weekend, sponsored by a New York Military History Society, where there was a professor from the Marine Corps College who similarly attempted to essentially minimize and deny and relativize the events based on fringe accounts of counterinsurgency by armed Armenians, no more proportionally than, of course, Jews during the Holocaust, namely the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, in certain instances attempted to defend themselves. If I can ask, and if we can begin to the premise for that question and that discussion about the issue that at the end of World War I, unlike the end of World War II, Turkey was not occupied by the Allied governments. And to what extent was that really the precondition, the fact that the occupation of Germany really led, or to some extent they were compelled to recognize the Holocaust, and no such compulsion at the time was carried out by the Allies onto the defeated Turkish government?
Well, thank you for those points. You're right, Adam. Genocide denial goes hand in hand with genocide. It's the last phase of genocide, and we see this denial generation after generation. The Turkish government obviously is the lone standing government, other than maybe Armenia's sworn enemy Azerbaijan, that denies the genocide. I think one of the ways I'd like to respond to this is Raphael Lemkin, who coined the word genocide, who had survived the Holocaust. The word genocide didn't exist when over 1 million Armenians were slaughtered by the Turkish government. It was called race extermination, race liquidation. Even the word Holocaust was applied to what happened to the Armenians. When Lemkin coined the word genocide, he immediately applied it to what happened to the Armenians in World War I. Armenians did witness that there were Turkish courts-martial tribunals, but they were aborted. It was unlike Nuremberg, where they had this the world looking at the war tribunals against the Nazi war criminals. So what you see is when you don't have this punishment of the perpetrators, you allow genocide denial to continue. One of the things that Lemkin has written in his most recent memoir called Totally Unofficial, the autobiography of Raphael Lemkin, it came out last year, published by Yale University Press. He writes that a nation was killed and the guilty persons were set free, talking about the Armenian. He says, why is a man punished when he kills another man, yet the killing of 1 million is a lesser crime than the killing of an individual? That's what Lemkin looked at when he saw the Armenians and saw what happened. This was such an enormous crime, but the perpetrators were largely set free or were not punished. And that is probably, obviously, incites more denial. And when you don't have that punishment and when you don't have that affirmation that the guilty must be, sent to jail for their crimes, denial continues.
And what's, of course, quite striking is that some of the chief architect, who really was essentially a dictator of the Young Turk government, Talat Pasha, is, in a sense, celebrated as a hero in modern Turkey, and there's a huge mausoleum dedicated to him. And an interesting historical note is that the chief perpetrators, including Talat, fled to Germany after the First World War, where they were essentially given asylum. But thankfully, certain Armenians caught up with them and were able to take justice into their own hands. And that it was no one less than Adolf Hitler who sent the body of Talat Pasha back from Berlin to Turkey in the middle of the Second World War, at the high point of the Holocaust, from one genocidal leader to another. And another point to make, I think, is, of course, that no sense of reparations or even cultural reconstruction occurred and has occurred since that time. And I mentioned at the outset the thousands and thousands of churches, amongst, of course, all personal property that was despoiled, and through which there is, and please inform whether there are any attempts or ability to recover the lost cultural heritage and patrimony, also considering the fact that the Turkish government spends millions to suppress this evidence instead of providing reparations or cultural reconstruction.
Well, it's the continuation of the crime, Adam. It's not just a lack of cultural reconstruction, it's cultural destruction, it's cultural genocide. The genocide continues every time that it's denied. And of course, the Turks have been doing it for 99 years, and they want to do it so that there are no survivors left. And the number of survivors of the Armenian genocide today are in the single digits. And so what they do is they continue this denial campaign using, as you pointed out, millions and millions of dollars to flood, attempts to deny the genocide. And for the most part, I would have to say that campaign has been unsuccessful in the scholarly community. I mean, the fact is that when you look at most of the genocide scholars, the academic chairs, the Holocaust scholars, the directors of Holocaust and genocide research centers, all of them unanimously come to the conclusion that the Armenian genocide is indisputable. As a matter of fact, in Philadelphia in the year 2000, 126 Holocaust scholars confirmed the incontestable fact of the Armenian genocide when they were gathered here in Philadelphia. So from that perspective, you have a widespread documentation of the Armenian genocide, and that is incontestable. What you see on the contrary, however, is you see the political football component of the Armenian genocide when it comes time to governments recognizing or reaffirming the Armenian genocide, and I think that's another regrettable component of Turkish denial.
I'd like to move now to a recent ruling, and this is in Europe just a few months ago, a ruling by the European Court of Human Rights that convicted a Turkish national who called the Armenian genocide an international lie, and that he also this person was guilty of racial discrimination. And this is also a country, one has to say Switzerland, one of the few in Europe that in their own national parliaments, including France, including Sweden, have also commemorated and recognized the Armenian genocide. But the disturbing ruling of the European Court of Justice after the conviction in Switzerland, which said that this conviction was a denial of and violated the principle of freedom of expression, meaning that the European Court of Justice did not uphold that Armenian genocide denial should be a crime.
Yes, and that decision is on appeal to the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights, and I strongly believe that it will be corrected and adjusted because the findings are fraught with errors, not only legal errors and factual errors, but the court's rationale in that case is fundamentally flawed. I want to point out to your listeners that the comment that you made, which is that this Turkish national simply said the Armenian genocide is an international lie. I mean, he obviously was motivated purely by racial animus. He wasn't inciting people to commit genocide. He was simply taking the Turkish government's line that the Armenian genocide is a myth. And of course, every scholar who studies the Armenian genocide knows that the Armenian genocide is no more an Armenian myth than the Jewish Holocaust is a Jewish myth. But as you point out, this Turkish national was found guilty of racial discrimination. I believe in 2007, his conviction was upheld, and he appealed to the European Court of Human Rights. The decision is, I think, flawed on a number of grounds, but here's what I think the court said. The court said that there could be, they questioned whether or not genocide as a legal concept was difficult to prove, and that they questioned whether the subject of the Armenian genocide is open to debate. And I think those are the findings that I think offended not only the Armenian community, but the Human Rights Committee globally. And I think that's why the Swiss government is taking an appeal. As a lawyer, and this is just my personal view, I'm not in favor of criminalizing the offense of negation. I realize that this is a crime in many countries around the world, not in the United States. But just because I don't believe that the crime of genocide denial, the negation, should be criminalized, doesn't mean that I don't take that speech seriously. I do believe it's dangerous, and I do believe it ought to be combated with good speech. I think good speech and the truth drowns out bad speech like this, the one made by this Turkish national. So there's a real question in the international community that follows the freedom of expression, were these words incited to kill? Do words kill? Does hate speech and incitement to genocide, is it a crime? I believe the U.S. Holocaust Council and Museum is holding a lecture on May 7 in Arizona, in Phoenix, just on this topic. In my opinion, you have to take genocide denial very seriously because it promotes a culture of this continued denial, this disrespect for human rights. But I do think that when the Grand Chamber hears the overall case, they're obviously going to correct the incorrect factual findings of the lower court.
It's an interesting perspective that seems to reflect a certain civil, libertarian, humanitarian, American perspective because, as we know, legislation in the post-war period in the European continent, including, of course, the perpetrators of the Holocaust in Germany and Austria, have criminalized and banned, of course, not only denial, but also the features connected, whether it's display of swastika, the sale of Mein Kampf, have been banned for decades. And, of course, in a context where they have the legacy of the perpetrators essentially right at their front door. And, of course, the United States, which upholds civil liberties and freedom of expression, including in a marketplace of ideas, let's say, as you mentioned, where good speech can counter bad speech. But would you still hold your position, Mr. Momjian, also for in the European context, or in, obviously, if this were one day to be possible, in Turkey itself?
Well, as you know, it's amazingly hypocritical for the Turkish government to weigh in on this at all because its human rights record with respect to freedom of expression is by far the worst in Europe. I mean, it more closely parallels China with respect to how many prosecutions they have against writers. But with regard to my personal view, as you point out, I take a very civil libertarian view. I was trained as a lawyer in the United States. I truly believe in freedom of expression. And like I said, I don't think that this Turkish national did anything other than display pure racial animus. That happens a lot. We have to deal with that as a society, and I think we deal with that by proving how wrong these people are and exposing them for their statements that are untrue. Whether or not the European model is something, believe me, I'm speaking only on my own behalf, but I'm sure there are people who obviously understand that even the genocide denial could be potentially dangerous. I actually agree that it could be potentially dangerous. I just don't believe in its criminalization. So, yes, there is some speech that we have to criminalize. I mean, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater and get away with that. It's dangerous. You can't incite genocide because that is aiding and abetting genocide, murder. That is dangerous. But when someone comes out in an anti-intellectual forum and says the Jewish Holocaust is a lie or a myth, I don't necessarily believe or subscribe to the view that that is something that should be criminalized. Even though I deplore the speech, even though I castigate it, I don't believe that necessarily should be criminalized. Now, believe me, there are Armenians in the United States that take a different view, and I respect that view, and this is a subject of scholarly concern. But in my view, the reason why the Grand Chamber is going to reverse the lower court's decision is because it was fundamentally hypocritical in the way they looked at the Armenian genocide versus the Holocaust, for instance. In other words, when the court looked at it and said, if this is not the same as denying that the gas chambers existed. Well, I start thinking, when you look at a decision like that and you look at the rationale, you really get worried that, well, one genocide is going to be acknowledged, one genocide denial is going to be acknowledged as a crime, but another isn't. I think that's where you get into very dangerous territory.
Absolutely. And this confluence, and I'd like to close here on this question of how it is that the geostrategic reality of the world coalesced in such a way, and it's one of the most confounding situations with regards to the remembrance of the Armenian genocide, that the nation founded in the wake of the next genocide, of the Holocaust, and its strongest ally, if not patron, namely the United States of America, also which has one of the largest and most religious Christian populations in the world, and needless to remind our audience that the Armenian genocide was the largest single martyrdom of Christians in the history of Christianity, and of course a lot of the animus of Turks was not, it was Muslim versus Christian, but it was also an ethno-proto-racial idea of pan-Turkic against the Armenian ethnic population and ethnic group, but that the coalescence of strategic interests because of Turkey's location, because of the Iraq and Afghanistan war, because of Israel's lack of other allies here, that we are still in a situation where the countries, in some sense, that are closest, the United States and Israel, have not, and one could obviously say that one of them would follow the other, that they would go together in finally recognizing the genocide. And Israel, of course, which has an ancient and significant Armenian community, especially in the old city of Jerusalem, I wonder, can we envision what kind of alteration in geostrategic reality would create that finally, even though at the beginning we mentioned this, President Obama promised he would recognize this officially, did not follow through. I know that there are some developments on that matter. How do you see, what do we need the conditions to be altered in order to finally have full American and even Israeli involvement on this issue?
We're getting there. I think we're getting there internationally, but as I pointed out earlier, when genocide is made into a political football, you have these challenges, and I think that's part of the international political process. In 2008, Senator Obama said in writing, the fact of the Armenian genocide is undeniable, and as president, I will recognize the Armenian genocide. And we waited year in and year out and watched him talk about the deaths of 1.5 million Armenians who were killed in massacres and atrocities, but he refuses to use the G word. And that's part of the geopolitical reality that you mentioned, Adam. This has happened time in and time out, where the Turkish government threatens Americans militarily. They say they'll close bases. They threaten Israel with the same type of strong-arm tactics. And it's a reality that when you get to this level, you need leaders who are morally courageous. And, we're hoping that President Obama does the right thing, not just because it's the 99th or the 100th, but because it's the right thing. It's truthful. And a lot of presidents, including President Reagan, President Carter, have used the word genocide, and they've been brave enough to do that without fear of Turkey's threats. But we saw what happened when France recognized the Armenian genocide. Turkey went through and made all these possible threats, but the governments still have diplomatic relations today. The United States can withstand these type of Turkish extortionist threats, and I believe ultimately it will one day reaffirm using the genocide word and not just dancing around it like it currently does.
No, that's very important, and I believe just recently, is it not the case that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee just had a vote on recognizing the genocide?
It did. On April 10th, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee approved the latest Armenian genocide resolution, and of course now in the corridors all of this geopolitical dancing is taking place. And we're hopeful that the world will continue to reaffirm this incredible and profound crime that was committed in the early part of the 20th century. We think that as continued Nobel laureates, the Elie Wiesel Foundation has been an incredible source of reaffirming the Armenian genocide. There have been sources in Israel, whether members of parliament and other leaders have used the word genocide. It is a process. I think there are probably 20 to 25 countries in the world that have recognized the Armenian genocide. We have many resolutions in Congress. There's been 43 states that have recognized it. This is not a case where people don't know about it. It's a question of moral courage and whether or not a sitting president will use the genocide word and not be bullied. And we see what's going on in Syria today, and we really question whether or not another genocide is going to take place. So we see this rallying cry of never again. We've heard the rallying cry over and over, yet we see genocide repeated generation after generation. We need to be vigilant, and I think that's the message on the 99th anniversary of the Armenian genocide. Never again has to apply to the whole world, and we need to continue to be vigilant to make sure that genocides are not repeated.
And also from a larger historical perspective, it's quite what we've seen in the last 10 or 15 years from the Middle East, specifically from Iraq, but of course also now in the civil war in Syria, is an exodus of the Christian population. And this is, of course, the oldest Christian population in the world, and in a way one could see that the case of the Armenian genocide and the massacres prior to that, in a way presaged or foreshadowed the fact that the reality is that the oldest Christian population in the world has been slowly decimated.
Well, there's no question, and of course, on the walls etched in marble in the U.S. Holocaust Museum is Hitler's quote to his generals in August 1939 at Obersalzberg, where he says very affirmatively, "Who today remembers the annihilation of the Armenians?" Hitler understood that. Hitler understood that the world quickly forgot what happened to the Armenian people in 1915, and he told his generals that people will forget it. That was his excuse to invade Poland and to begin the Holocaust. And this is the message that we carry with us, and it is a burden on all successive generations to make sure that genocide never happens again.
And it's a burden we all share, and with that, let me please thank you for your time and for your insight and for sharing, Mr. Momjian.
Thank you, Adam.
Take care. Thank you.